What would you do if you had nothing left? Just $2 in your pocket and someone else needed it more. For a homeless boy named Ethan, that choice changed everything. A selfless act, a stranger watching from afar, and a life forever transformed. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The biting wind cut through Ethan Miles' thin hoodie as he trudged along the cracked sidewalks of Arborview. His breath puffed out in small clouds, disappearing into the frigid winter air. The streets were lined with faded brick buildings and shuttered storefronts, remnants of a once thriving industrial town, now left to decay. Ethan clutched the straps of his worn backpack tightly, his fingers stiff from the cold. For a 14-year-old, Ethan carried the weariness of someone much older. His life revolved around survival, finding enough food to quiet the gnawing hunger, a warm corner to rest his aching body, and avoiding trouble that seemed to lurk at every turn. Yet, despite his struggles, there was a resilience in his step, a flicker of determination in his dark eyes that refused to be extinguished. He passed the corner diner, its neon sign flickering faintly. Ethan glanced through the frosted windows, catching the faint glow of warmth and the smell of bacon and eggs wafting through the door. The owner, a burly man named Joe, was busy behind the counter. Joe had a gruff exterior, but he let Ethan clean tables and sweep floors in exchange for leftover food. "Morning, kid," Joe called as Ethan pushed open the door, bringing a gust of cold air with him. "Morning, Joe," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse but polite. Joe handed him a plate with a couple of slices of toast and scrambled eggs, muttering, "Eat up, you'll need it in this weather." Ethan nodded gratefully, sliding into the booth furthest from the door. As he ate, he watched the other patrons, a mix of weary locals and construction workers, chatting over steaming mugs of coffee. The warmth of the diner seeped into his bones, offering a brief reprieve from the bitter cold outside. After finishing his meal, Ethan wiped down the tables and swept the floors, as promised. He didn't linger when his work was done. He slipped out with a quiet thanks to Joe, stepping back into the unforgiving streets. As the day wore on, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Arborview. Ethan wandered the streets aimlessly, his eyes scanning for anything useful. A discarded can, a scrap of fabric to patch his worn clothes. The town moved around him in a haze of indifference. People rushed past, their collars turned up against the wind, their gazes fixed firmly ahead, as though avoiding eye contact with someone like him might keep their own troubles at bay. At the edge of a small park, Ethan paused. His gaze fell on a figure huddled on a bench, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. It was an older woman, her frail frame shivering against the cold. She clutched a small paper cup, her knuckles white, as though holding on to it might stave off the bitter reality around her. Ethan hesitated, his heart tightening at the sight. He knew what it was like to be invisible, to feel the world pass by as if you didn't exist. The woman's hunched posture reminded him of his mother in her final days, trying to stay strong even when her body was failing her. Ethan stood at the edge of the park, his breath curling in the icy air as he stared at the frail figure on the bench. Her paper cup sat limply in her hands, as though even the small effort of holding it required more strength than she could muster. He shifted his weight, unsure of what to do. In his pocket, crumpled and damp, was his last $2 bill. It wasn't much, barely enough for a sandwich or a cup of soup at Joe's diner. His stomach growled at the thought, reminding him of the half-eaten toast he had scraped off Joe's plate that morning. It hadn't been enough, and he knew the gnawing hunger wouldn't let up any time soon. Ethan turned his gaze back to the woman. She looked older up close, though it was hard to tell. Her face was lined with deep creases, her eyes shadowed and sunken, and her fingers were red from the cold. She pulled the blanket tighter around her frail body, but it did little to shield her from the wind cutting through the park. His chest tightened. He knew this life. The endless search for warmth, the hollow ache of an empty stomach, the invisible walls that seemed to separate people like them from the rest of the world. Yet, something about her felt different. She looked like someone who had once been full of life, but life had taken everything away. Ethan's fingers tightened around the bill in his pocket. He could keep walking, pretend he hadn't seen her. It wouldn't be the first time he'd turned away from someone in need. He had to. Survival demanded selfishness. But a memory flashed through his mind. His mother, pale and sickly, sitting at their old kitchen table, pushing the last piece of bread toward him while her own stomach growled. "Always share what you can, Ethan," she had whispered. "You never know who might need it more than you." He sighed, his resolve hardening. Ethan approached the bench cautiously, the worn soles of his sneakers crunching against the frozen ground. The woman didn't notice him at first, her eyes staring blankly ahead. "Ma'am," Ethan said, his voice tentative. The woman flinched, her head snapping toward him. Her eyes were wide with alarm, as though she expected him to shout at her, or worse. I just... Ethan hesitated, pulling the bill from his pocket and holding it out. "Here, it's not much, but maybe it'll help." The woman's gaze dropped to the money, her hands trembling as she reached for it. "Why?" she croaked, her voice hoarse and thin. You don't have to." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice quiet. "But you look like you need it." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over and tracing the deep lines in her cheeks. She clutched the bill to her chest as though it were a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "God bless you, child." Ethan nodded, shoving his hands into his hoodie pocket to keep them from shaking. He glanced around, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, though the park seemed deserted. He didn't do it for thanks, but her words stuck with him as he turned and walked away. From across the street, Caleb Hartman watched the scene unfold from the warmth of his car. His sharp eyes followed Ethan's every move, from the hesitation in his step to the quiet determination as he handed over the bill. Caleb leaned back in his seat, his mind turning over what he'd just witnessed. "Interesting," he murmured to himself, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He pulled out a leather notebook from the passenger seat and began to scribble notes. "This boy, he's different." The engine hummed softly as Caleb closed his notebook and stared out the window, watching Ethan disappear into the gray streets of Arborview. Ethan's stomach growled again as he walked away from the park. He hadn't solved the woman's problems. $2 was nothing in the grand scheme of things, but her tearful thank you had left a warmth in his chest that almost made him forget his own hunger. Almost. His feet carried him back toward the abandoned building he called home, his mind swirling with thoughts. Did she have somewhere safe to sleep tonight? Would the money be enough to get her through another day? He shook his head, trying to push the questions away. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. The streets didn't reward overthinking. The creak of a rusted hinge greeted Ethan as he pushed open the warped wooden door to his makeshift home. The abandoned building had once been a small hardware store, but time and neglect had stripped it of its former purpose. Now, it was little more than 4 crumbling walls and a leaking roof, offering just enough shelter to keep the worst of the winter cold at bay. Ethan stepped inside, his breath visible in the frigid air. He set his backpack down in the corner, pulling out the few possessions he had: a threadbare blanket, a dented flashlight, and a tin can he used to collect rainwater. The faint sound of the wind whistling through cracks in the walls was the only company he had. As the dim glow of dusk seeped through the broken windows, Ethan sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, staring at the single beam of moonlight illuminating the space. He thought about the woman in the park, her trembling hands, her tear-filled eyes. Had she found a place to stay tonight? Or was she still out there, battling the cold alone? His stomach rumbled again, a painful reminder of his own sacrifices. The last $2 he'd had was gone. Yet, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he didn't regret it. A part of him felt lighter, like he'd managed to hold on to something his circumstances hadn't stolen: his humanity. Ethan lay back on the cold concrete floor, pulling his blanket over his body. The ceiling above him was a patchwork of broken tiles and exposed beams, and through one gap, he could see a faint star twinkling in the dark sky. As sleep began to creep in, Ethan's mind wandered to a time before the streets became his home. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, warm and soft, like the blanket she used to tuck around him. "Ethan, life won't always be easy," she had said, her fingers brushing his unruly hair out of his face. "But even when the world feels cold, you can make it a little warmer by being kind. Kindness is like a spark. It doesn't look like much, but it can start a fire." He could still see her face in his mind's eye, tired but kind, her smile hiding the pain she carried. That was before everything fell apart, before the medical bills piled up, before the landlord's threats turned into eviction notices, and before her illness finally took her from him. After his mother passed, Ethan and his father were left to navigate a world that seemed bent on breaking them. His father tried, he really did. But grief has a way of hollowing out even the strongest of people. Alcohol became his escape, and the man Ethan once looked up to slowly disappeared. One night, the shouting started. Ethan still remembered the sound of bottles shattering against the wall, and the way his father's slurred words cut deeper than the winter wind. That was the night Ethan decided to leave. He packed his backpack with what little he had and walked out into the unknown, carrying nothing but his mother's lessons and his own will to survive. Ethan's eyes fluttered open as the sound of water dripping from a nearby pipe pulled him back to the present. The room was dark now, the moonlight his only source of illumination. He reached for his flashlight, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the space. The emptiness felt heavier at night, pressing down on him like the weight of every decision he'd made to get here. Ethan tightened his blanket around himself, letting out a slow breath. "I hope you're warm tonight, ma'am," he murmured into the dark. The morning light streamed weakly through the cracks in the boarded-up windows of Ethan's makeshift shelter. He stirred under his thin blanket, his body stiff from the unforgiving cold of the concrete floor. The air inside the abandoned hardware store was damp, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the walls. Ethan rubbed his eyes, his stomach growling as the emptiness inside reminded him that another day had begun. With a groan, he pushed himself up, reaching for his backpack to retrieve what little he had. A bottle of water, nearly empty, and a tin can with a few crumbs left from the previous night. He shook the can, sighed, and tucked it back into the bag. As he moved toward the door, something caught his eye, a small bundle resting just outside the threshold. Ethan froze, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. The bundle was wrapped in a piece of old newspaper, held together with a piece of twine. It looked oddly out of place against the weathered wooden steps. He stepped cautiously toward it, his heart pounding. Nobody ever left things for him. He knelt down, his fingers fumbling with the knot of the twine. As the newspaper unfolded, he stared in disbelief. Inside was a neatly packed sandwich, a small bottle of juice, and an envelope with a note scrawled in thick black ink. "Kindness matters." Ethan sat back on his heels, the words echoing in his mind. He glanced around, scanning the empty lot for any sign of who might have left it. There was no one in sight. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. He picked up the sandwich, his stomach growling louder at the sight of the fresh bread and neatly sliced cheese. The juice was cold to the touch, a rare treat. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with questions. Who had left this? Why? After a brief moment of doubt, hunger won. He unwrapped the sandwich and took a cautious bite. It was simple but satisfying, the first decent meal he'd had in days. As he ate, he kept glancing at the note, the words almost daring him to believe that someone out there cared. Across the street, hidden in the shadow of a parked sedan, Caleb Hartman watched through the corner of his windshield. The boy's reaction was exactly what Caleb had anticipated. Cautious, almost skeptical, but undeniably grateful. Caleb scribbled a quick note in the leather-bound journal resting on his lap. Ethan, cautious but kind. His act yesterday wasn't for show. This kid's got heart. The retired journalist leaned back in his seat, his gray eyes narrowing as he observed Ethan finish the sandwich. Caleb had spent years chasing stories, exposing corruption, reporting on social injustices, but lately, his life had felt stagnant, disconnected. The spark he once had for uncovering the truth had dimmed, but watching Ethan, Caleb felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and reached for his thermos, taking a sip of coffee. "Let's see where this goes," he muttered under his breath, before jotting down another note. Find a way to approach him without scaring him off. Ethan finished his breakfast, tucking the empty bottle and the note into his backpack. The words "kindness matters" wouldn't leave his mind. He stood and glanced around again, half expecting someone to step out from the shadows. Who would leave this here? He mumbled to himself, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind. His first instinct was suspicion. Life on the streets had taught him to be wary of anything that seemed too good to be true. But a small part of him, the part that still clung to the lessons his mother had taught him, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was genuine. As he slung his backpack over his shoulder and headed into the city, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder a few times, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Caleb watched Ethan disappear around the corner, the boy's cautious glances telling him everything he needed to know. "Smart kid," Caleb murmured. He drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, debating his next move. He knew the importance of timing. Rushing in too soon could scare Ethan off, but waiting too long might close the window of trust. He reached for his notebook again, flipping through pages filled with scrawled observations and half-formed plans. He paused at a blank page and wrote, "Approach Ethan at the diner. Neutral ground. Build trust slowly." Satisfied, Caleb closed the notebook and started the car. As he pulled away from the curb, he felt a strange sense of anticipation, as though he were standing at the edge of a story that could change more lives than just Ethan's. The morning air was crisp as Ethan pushed open the door to Joe's diner. The familiar jingle of the bell overhead echoed through the small space, momentarily drawing the attention of the few customers inside. The warmth from the kitchen and the aroma of frying bacon hit him like a welcome embrace, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Ethan pulled his hood down and shuffled to the corner booth he had come to think of as his own. Joe, standing behind the counter with a towel slung over his shoulder, raised a bushy eyebrow in recognition. "You're early today, kid," Joe called out, his gruff voice softened by familiarity. "Yeah, thought I'd get a head start," Ethan replied, sliding into the booth. Joe smirked and walked over, setting down a chipped ceramic mug. "Coffee, light on the caffeine, heavy on the sugar. Don't say I never did nothing for you." "Thanks," Ethan said, wrapping his cold hands around the mug. The sweet, watered-down coffee was enough to take the edge off the morning's chill. As he sipped, Ethan noticed a man sitting a few tables away. Dressed in a long, dark coat and a scarf, the man looked out of place amid the work boots and flannel shirts of the diner's regulars. He seemed absorbed in a notebook, occasionally glancing up, as though checking his surroundings. Ethan's stomach tightened. Something about the man felt familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. The man closed his notebook, tucking it into the inside pocket of his coat. He stood, picked up his coffee, and walked toward Ethan's booth. Ethan's grip on his mug tightened instinctively. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, his voice polite but firm. Ethan hesitated. His instincts screamed to say no, to avoid whatever this man might want. But there was something disarming about him, something that didn't set off the same alarms Ethan had learned to trust. "Sure," Ethan said reluctantly, shifting to make room. The man sat down, setting his coffee cup on the table between them. "I saw you at the park yesterday," he began, his tone casual but deliberate, "with the woman on the bench." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, replaying the encounter. Was this man upset? Did he think Ethan had done something wrong? "Look," Ethan said quickly, his voice defensive. "I wasn't bothering her or anything. I just gave her some money, that's all." The man held up a hand, his expression calm. "Relax, kid. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. Quite the opposite, actually." Ethan frowned, his suspicion deepening. "Then what do you want?" The man leaned back in the booth, studying Ethan for a moment. "I'm Caleb Hartman. I used to be a journalist. Now I just observe. And what I observed yesterday was a kid who didn't have much to give, giving anyway. That's rare." Ethan didn't know how to respond. Compliments weren't something he was used to, especially not from strangers. He shrugged, his voice low. "It wasn't a big deal." "It was," Caleb countered, his voice steady but kind. "It may not seem like much to you, but to someone like her, that act of kindness could mean everything." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure what to make of this man. "Why do you care?" Caleb smiled faintly, as though he had expected the question. "Because I think you've got potential, Ethan. Potential to be more than just a kid trying to survive, and I want to help." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "How do you know my name?" "I've been watching," Caleb admitted, his voice calm but firm. "Not in a creepy way, I promise. I just wanted to understand who you are before I approached you. That's weird, Ethan said bluntly, leaning back in his seat. Why would you do that? What do you want from me? Caleb's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet sincerity. I don't want anything from you, Ethan. I want to help. People helped me once when I was down, and I figure it's my turn to pay it forward. Ethan shook his head, his guard firmly in place. I don't need help. I'm fine on my own. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his tone soft but resolute. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're doing everything you can just to get by. That's not living, kid. That's surviving. And you deserve better. Ethan's throat tightened at the words. He wanted to argue, to tell Caleb he didn't understand. But deep down, a part of him couldn't deny the truth in what Caleb was saying. Joe approached the table, breaking the tension. You two want anything besides coffee, or are you just here to stare at each other all day? Caleb chuckled, pulling out his wallet. 2 plates of whatever's hot, Joe. My treat. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Caleb cut him off. Consider it a thank you for what you did yesterday. Ethan's stomach betrayed him with a loud growl, and he slumped back in his seat. Fine, he muttered, but just this once. Joe returned a few minutes later with 2 steaming plates of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. The aroma was enough to make Ethan's mouth water, but he hesitated, glancing at Caleb. Go ahead, Caleb said, picking up his fork. It's not poisoned, I promise. Ethan rolled his eyes but dug in, the warmth of the food spreading through him like a lifeline. For a moment, they ate in silence, the tension easing slightly with each bite. As Caleb finished his meal, he leaned back and studied Ethan again. I'll be around, kid. If you ever decide you're ready for something more, you know where to find me. Ethan looked up, his fork hovering over his plate. What's that supposed to mean? Caleb stood, tossing a few bills on the table to cover the check. It means I see something in you, Ethan. And I think, deep down, you see it too. With that, Caleb turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Ethan staring after him, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalks of Arborview, the cold air biting at Ethan's cheeks as he made his way back toward the park. His mind was still tangled with thoughts of Caleb Hartman, his sudden appearance, the strange offer of help, and the way he seemed to see right through Ethan's defenses. Ethan didn't trust him. Not yet. People didn't just show up out of nowhere offering kindness without expecting something in return. That much he had learned from experience. He turned the corner and caught sight of Maggie sitting on the same bench as before, her frail figure hunched over as she stared at the ground. The blanket draped over her shoulders looked heavier today, and there was a faint redness to her cheeks that suggested she'd managed to find some warmth. Ethan hesitated for a moment before crossing the street, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. He didn't know why he felt compelled to check on her, but something about the look in her eyes the day before had stayed with him. Maggie, he called softly as he approached. The woman looked up slowly, her eyes squinting against the sun. When she recognized him, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Well, if it isn't my angel from yesterday, she said, her voice raspy but warm. Come to check on an old woman, have you? Ethan shrugged, trying to appear casual. Just passing by, he lied. You doing okay? Maggie chuckled, a sound that was equal parts amusement and exhaustion. As okay as someone like me can be, I suppose. That $2 you gave me bought me a hot meal and a cup of coffee. Made me feel human again, at least for a little while. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't a big deal. It was to me, Maggie replied, her voice softening. Kindness like that, it's rare these days. She motioned for Ethan to sit beside her, and after a brief hesitation, he did. The bench creaked under his weight, the cold wood pressing through his thin layers of clothing. Maggie leaned back, her gaze drifting to the bare branches of the trees overhead. You probably think I've always been like this, she said, gesturing to herself. A broken old woman living on the streets. Ethan didn't respond, unsure of what to say. I wasn't always, Maggie continued, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness. There was a time when I had a home, a family, and a career. I was an artist, believe it or not. Not famous or anything, but enough to make a living. I painted landscapes, portraits, even murals for schools and libraries. My work was my life. Her hands, weathered and trembling, rested on her lap. Ethan noticed how they moved, as though they were still trying to hold a paintbrush that wasn't there. "What happened?" Ethan asked quietly. Maggie let out a slow breath, her shoulders sagging. "Life happened. I lost my son, my only child, to a car accident when he was just 10 years old. After that, I couldn't paint. Every stroke of the brush reminded me of him, the way he used to sit and watch me, always so curious. Losing him broke something inside me." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And when I couldn't work, I couldn't pay the bills. The house was repossessed. Friends tried to help, but grief makes you push people away. Before I knew it, I was out here, trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense anymore." Ethan felt a lump in his throat as he listened. He had seen grief before, felt it even, but hearing Maggie's story put his own struggles into perspective. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie turned to him, her tired eyes meeting his. "Because I see something in you, kid. Something that reminds me of the person I used to be. You're tough, but you're not hard. You've still got a good heart, and that's worth holding on to." Ethan looked away, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people seeing him like that, as more than just a homeless kid scraping by. "I don't know about that," he muttered. "I just do what I can to survive." Maggie smiled faintly. "Surviving is one thing, but don't let the world take away who you are. Kindness, compassion, those things matter, even when it feels like they don't." Her words echoed in his mind, mingling with his mother's voice from years ago. Kindness is a spark. Ethan stood, his hands still jammed in his pockets. "You need anything?" he asked, his voice gruff. Maggie shook her head. "I'll be fine for now, thanks to you. But you take care of yourself, Ethan. You've got a long road ahead, and it's not an easy one." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "You too, Maggie." As he walked away, he glanced back once, watching as Maggie pulled the blanket tighter around herself. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange sense of connection to her, as though their lives were somehow intertwined. From a nearby bench, Caleb Hartman watched the exchange unfold, his notebook resting on his knee. He had seen enough interviews and interactions in his lifetime to recognize the unspoken bond forming between the boy and the woman. "This kid's got layers," Caleb muttered, jotting down a few more notes. He knew he had to tread carefully. Ethan was skittish, and any wrong move could push him further away. But seeing the way Ethan interacted with Maggie confirmed what Caleb already suspected. This boy was worth the effort. Closing his notebook, Caleb stood and walked away, leaving Ethan and Maggie to their moment. Ethan walked aimlessly through the streets of Arborview, his mind tangled in a web of thoughts. Maggie's story lingered in his head, her words heavy with loss and resilience. For the first time in a long time, he felt something beyond his usual numbness, a flicker of connection, of purpose. As he turned the corner onto Main Street, he spotted a familiar figure leaning casually against a lamppost. Caleb Hartman's dark coat and sharp gaze stood out against the backdrop of weathered buildings. Ethan froze. He thought about turning around, but Caleb noticed him and waved. There was no avoiding him now. "Ethan," Caleb called, his tone friendly but firm. "Got a minute?" Ethan sighed, shoving his hands into his hoodie pocket as he approached. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Just to talk," Caleb replied, gesturing to a nearby bench. "Sit with me for a bit?" Reluctantly, Ethan sat, keeping a safe distance. He watched Caleb warily, waiting for the catch. People didn't offer help without wanting something in return. That much he knew. "I'll get straight to the point," Caleb began, his hands clasped together as he leaned forward. "I think you're smart, resourceful, and stronger than most adults I know. But you're stuck, Ethan, and I want to help you get unstuck." Ethan raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms defensively. "Why? What's in it for you?" Caleb smiled faintly, as though he'd anticipated the question. "I told you before, I've been where you are. Maybe not the exact same situation, but I know what it's like to feel invisible, to fight just to keep your head above water. Someone helped me once when I needed it most. Now, it's my turn to do the same. Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. I don't need your charity. It's not charity, Caleb said firmly. It's an opportunity, one that you've more than earned. Ethan frowned, his skepticism unwavering. What kind of opportunity? Caleb leaned back slightly, giving Ethan space. I have a daughter, Amelia. She's a social worker, works with kids like you. I want to connect you with her. She can help you get into school, find a safe place to stay, maybe even get you thinking about a future beyond just surviving. Ethan stared at Caleb, his mind reeling. School? A safe place? A future? It all sounded too good to be true. And what do you get out of it? He asked again, his voice sharp. Caleb's expression softened, his gray eyes meeting Ethan's. I get to keep a promise I made to myself a long time ago, that's all. Ethan stood abruptly, the bench creaking under the sudden shift in weight. Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't need your help. I've been fine on my own. Caleb stood too, his movements calm and deliberate. Fine? Is that what you call sleeping in an abandoned building, scrounging for scraps, and hoping no one notices you? That's not fine, Ethan. That's surviving. Ethan's hands balled into fists at his sides, anger and fear bubbling to the surface. You don't know anything about me. You're right, Caleb said, his voice steady. I don't know everything, but I know enough to see a kid who deserves better. Ethan turned to walk away, but Caleb's voice stopped him in his tracks. Think about Maggie, Caleb said quietly. You didn't hesitate to help her when you saw she needed it. Why won't you let someone help you? Ethan froze, Caleb's words cutting deeper than he expected. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He thought about Maggie, about her gratitude and her gentle warning. Don't let the world take away who you are. After a long pause, Ethan turned back, his eyes filled with both defiance and uncertainty. I don't trust you, he admitted. Caleb nodded. I wouldn't expect you to, but trust takes time. All I'm asking is for you to consider the offer. Talk to Amelia, see what she has to say. No strings attached. As they spoke, a pair of passers-by slowed their steps, glancing at Ethan and Caleb with thinly veiled curiosity. Their whispers carried on the cold breeze. Isn't that the kid from the corner? Always hanging around the diner? Yeah, wonder what he's up to with that man. Looks suspicious to me. Ethan's stomach twisted. He was used to being judged, but hearing the whispers aloud made his anger flare. See, he muttered bitterly, gesturing toward the onlookers. This is what people think of me. They don't care. Why should I? Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. They don't matter, Ethan. What matters is what you think of yourself. And from what I've seen, you're worth a hell of a lot more than their opinions. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in Caleb's tone. He wanted to argue, to dismiss the man's words, but part of him couldn't shake the truth behind them. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a small business card, holding it out to Ethan. This is Amelia's number. If you decide you're ready, give her a call. No pressure, no obligations. Ethan stared at the card for a moment before snatching it and shoving it into his pocket. I'll think about it, he muttered. That's all I ask, Caleb said with a small smile. Take care, Ethan. And remember, kindness matters, even when it's for yourself. With that, Caleb turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone on the sidewalk, the weight of the conversation pressing heavily on his chest. Ethan's fingers brushed against the card in his pocket as he started walking, his mind a storm of emotions. He didn't trust Caleb, not yet, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to imagine what life might look like if he did. The first icy raindrop struck Ethan's cheek as he hurried down the alley behind Joe's diner. He glanced up at the heavy, swirling clouds that had been looming all day, their edges lit faintly by the dying afternoon sun. The storm was coming, fierce, unrelenting, and dangerously cold. Ethan quickened his pace, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He needed to get back to the abandoned hardware store before the worst of it hit. But as the wind picked up, slicing through his thin hoodie, he realized his shelter wouldn't hold up against a storm this strong. By the time he reached the edge of the park, the rain had turned into a relentless downpour, soaking through his clothes and chilling him to the bone. He spotted a cluster of people huddled under a nearby pavilion, homeless men and women, their faces etched with exhaustion and worry. Among them was Maggie, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she clutched a cup of something steaming. Ethan hesitated, his instinct to keep moving warring with the pull to check on her. Finally, he crossed the muddy grass, his sneakers squelching with every step. Maggie looked up as he approached, her face brightening with recognition. "Ethan," she called, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "You're out in this mess?" "Didn't know it'd get this bad," Ethan admitted, brushing rain from his face. "What's everyone doing here?" "The community center's opening its doors for the night," Maggie explained. "A few volunteers came by to let us know. It's not much, but it's warm and it's dry." Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. The community center wasn't far, and it would be a better option than braving the storm in his usual spot. "You heading there now?" "Soon," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "Just waiting for a few others." Ethan glanced around at the small group, noticing the way they clung to one another for support. For a brief moment, he envied them. Even in their hardship, they had each other. Ethan had no one. As the rain intensified, Maggie stood, her frail frame swaying against the force of the wind. Ethan stepped closer, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Come on," he said. "Let's get moving." The group began their slow trek toward the community center, their steps unsteady on the slick pavement. Ethan kept close to Maggie, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of trouble. The storm had emptied the city, leaving behind an eerie quiet punctuated only by the sound of rain and the occasional crack of thunder. When they reached the center, the warm glow of its windows was like a beacon in the dark. Volunteers greeted them at the door, handing out dry blankets and cups of hot soup. The room inside was crowded, filled with people seeking refuge from the storm. Ethan hesitated at the threshold, the hum of voices and the crush of bodies making him feel suddenly claustrophobic. Maggie noticed his hesitation and touched his arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's safe here." Ethan nodded and stepped inside, the warmth hitting him like a wave. He found a spot against the wall, away from the crowd, and sank to the floor. Maggie sat beside him, cradling her cup of soup. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "For what?" Ethan asked, his voice gruff. "For sticking with me," Maggie replied. "It means more than you know." Ethan didn't respond, but her words stirred something in him, a small, fragile sense of purpose. As the evening wore on, the storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling the windows and rain pelting the roof. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise and the crowd, when a familiar voice jolted him awake. "There you are," Caleb Hartman said, standing in the doorway with his coat dripping wet. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ethan. Ethan groaned inwardly, his shoulders tensing. "What are you doing here?" he asked as Caleb approached. "Looking for you," Caleb replied matter-of-factly. He crouched down to meet Ethan's eye level. "This storm's no joke. You shouldn't be out in it." "I'm fine," Ethan said, his tone defensive. "I've got a place." Caleb raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "That place won't hold up in weather like this. You know that." Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. He hated how easily Caleb could see through him. "Come with me," Caleb said, his voice softening. "I've got room. You'll be safe." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Caleb sighed, his frustration evident. "Ethan, this isn't about pride or independence. This is about staying alive. Do you really think you can make it through the night on your own?" Ethan's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to yell, to push Caleb away. But the truth was undeniable. He didn't have anywhere safe to go, and the storm wasn't letting up. Before he could respond, Maggie spoke up. "Go with him, Ethan," she said quietly. "He's right. You can't do this alone." Ethan glanced at her, surprised. "You barely know him." "And neither do you," Maggie said with a faint smile. "But sometimes you have to take a chance on people." Ethan looked between Maggie and Caleb, his heart pounding. He didn't trust Caleb, at least not completely, but something in the man's eyes told him he was sincere. "Fine," Ethan muttered, pushing himself to his feet, "but just for the night." Caleb nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's all I'm asking." Ethan followed Caleb out into the rain, the cold biting at his skin despite the dry blanket draped over his shoulders. Caleb led him to a nearby car, its interior warm and dry. Ethan climbed in hesitantly, his nerves on edge as Caleb started the engine. As they drove away, Ethan glanced back at the community center, the lights glowing faintly through the storm. Maggie's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes you have to take a chance on people. For the first time in a long time, Ethan wondered if she was right. Ethan sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Caleb's car, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The soft hum of the heater filled the silence as they drove through the rain-slicked streets of Arborview. Caleb occasionally glanced at Ethan, but he didn't speak, giving the boy time to process everything that had just happened. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't believe he had agreed to this, to get into a stranger's car, to trust someone he barely knew. Every instinct screamed at him to be cautious, to keep his guard up. Yet, here he was, heading towards some unknown destination with Caleb Hartman. The streetlights cast long shadows on the wet pavement, the world outside the car blurred by rain streaks on the window. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice tight with suspicion. "Where are we going?" Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "To my place. It's not far, and I figured you could use a hot meal and a safe place to sleep." Ethan frowned. "Why are you doing this? What's in it for you?" Caleb sighed, his grip on the steering wheel tightening slightly. "You're not the first person to ask me that, you know. And the truth is, I don't expect anything in return. I'm just trying to pay forward the kindness I was shown when I needed it." Ethan snorted. "People don't just help others for no reason." "You're right," Caleb said, his tone calm. "Most don't. But that doesn't mean it's impossible." The car pulled into the driveway of a modest suburban home. It wasn't large or flashy, but the warm light spilling from the windows made it feel inviting. Caleb parked and turned to Ethan. "You don't have to trust me," he said, his voice steady, "but I'm offering you a chance to rest, to feel safe. You can leave any time you want." Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. Finally, he nodded and stepped out of the car, the cold rain immediately soaking his sneakers as he followed Caleb to the front door. Inside, the house was cozy and smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish. A stack of books rested on the coffee table, and a well-worn armchair sat by the fireplace. It was the kind of place Ethan had only ever seen on TV or in magazines. A real home. Caleb gestured toward the couch. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll grab you a towel and some dry clothes." Ethan nodded silently, his eyes darting around the room. He felt out of place, like a stray dog that had wandered into someone's living room. He sat gingerly on the edge of the couch, his wet clothes leaving faint marks on the upholstery. Caleb returned with a towel, a pair of sweatpants, and a sweatshirt. "These might be a bit big, but they're clean." "Thanks," Ethan mumbled, taking the clothes. He disappeared into the bathroom to change, grateful for the chance to warm up. When Ethan emerged, dry and slightly less guarded, Caleb was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. "Hope you like soup," Caleb called over his shoulder. "It's chicken noodle, nothing fancy, but it'll do the trick." Ethan's stomach growled loudly, betraying his hunger. He shuffled to the kitchen table and sat down, watching as Caleb ladled steaming soup into 2 bowls and placed one in front of him. They ate in silence for a while, the warmth of the soup easing the chill that had settled deep in Ethan's bones. Caleb didn't push, didn't ask any probing questions. He simply sat across from Ethan, giving him space. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice hesitant. "Why do you care what happens to me? You don't even know me." Caleb set his spoon down and leaned back slightly. "You're right. I don't know everything about you, but I've seen enough to know that you're worth helping. You've got potential, Ethan. You just need someone to remind you of that." Ethan looked down at his bowl, his appetite fading. "What if I don't want help? Then I won't force it," Caleb said simply. "But I think, deep down, you do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten in my car." Ethan didn't respond. He hated how easily Caleb seemed to read him, how his words cut through the walls Ethan had spent years building. After dinner, Caleb gestured for Ethan to join him in the living room. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the crackle of the fireplace filling the space. Finally, Caleb spoke. "Tell me about your mom," he said gently. "What was she like?" Ethan stiffened, his fingers gripping the edge of the couch. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I think she must have been someone special," Caleb replied. "Someone who taught you to care about others, even when you didn't have much yourself." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't push back. Slowly, the words began to spill out. He told Caleb about his mother's kindness, her strength, and how she had always put him first, even when she was sick. He talked about the day she died, the way everything had fallen apart after, and the anger he still carried toward his father for giving up. Caleb listened intently, never interrupting, his expression a mix of empathy and understanding. When Ethan finished, his throat felt raw, and his chest ached from the weight of the memories. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Caleb said quietly. "But your mom sounds like an incredible woman. She'd be proud of you." Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. He wasn't sure he believed Caleb, but the words still brought a small measure of comfort. As the night wore on, the tension between them began to ease. Caleb shared bits of his own story, how he had once been a struggling journalist, how he had lost touch with his daughter, Amelia, and how he was trying to make amends for the mistakes of his past. "I see a lot of myself in you," Caleb admitted. "That's why I'm doing this. Because I know what it feels like to think you're alone. But you're not, Ethan. Not anymore." Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he stayed quiet. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Caleb was telling the truth. As he lay on the couch that night, wrapped in a warm blanket, Ethan stared at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. The storm outside had begun to calm, but inside him, the storm was just beginning to settle. Trust didn't come easily, but for now, he was willing to take the first step. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds, its golden rays spilling into the living room where Ethan had spent the night. He blinked against the light streaming through the windows, his mind momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The warmth of the room, the softness of the blanket draped over him, it all felt foreign, like a dream he didn't dare believe was real. As he sat up, the faint smell of coffee and sizzling bacon wafted from the kitchen. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten much the day before. Hesitantly, Ethan got to his feet and shuffled toward the source of the smells. Caleb was standing at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. He glanced over his shoulder and offered a smile. "Morning. Hope you're hungry." Ethan hovered near the doorway, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I guess." "Sit," Caleb said, gesturing to the small kitchen table. "Breakfast is almost ready." Ethan obeyed, his movements awkward as he settled into a chair. The table was simple but inviting, with mismatched plates and a small vase of wildflowers that looked freshly picked. Caleb set a plate of pancakes, bacon, and eggs in front of him, along with a glass of orange juice. Ethan hesitated for a moment before digging in. The food was warm and filling, and for a few minutes he forgot about his worries. Caleb sat across from him, sipping coffee and letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. Once they had finished eating, Caleb cleared the dishes and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "So, what's the plan, Ethan?" Ethan frowned, his fork paused midair. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you want to do next?" Caleb said, his tone gentle but firm. "You've got a roof over your head for now, but that's not enough. You deserve more than just surviving. You deserve a life." Ethan stared at his plate, the weight of Caleb's words pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never really thought about it." "Well, maybe it's time to start," Caleb said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, sliding it across the table toward Ethan. "This is Amelia's number. She's expecting your call." Ethan's chest tightened as he picked up the card, the name and phone number staring back at him like a challenge. Why is she doing this? Why are you doing this? Caleb's expression softened. "Because you remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who needed help but was too proud to ask for it. And because I see potential in you, Ethan. You've got a good heart, and you've been through more than most people your age. You deserve a chance to build something better." Later that afternoon, Caleb drove Ethan to the local community center where Amelia worked. Ethan fidgeted in his seat, his nerves fraying with every passing mile. He didn't know what to expect, and the idea of opening up to another stranger made his stomach churn. When they arrived, Caleb led him inside, the familiar hum of activity filling the air. Volunteers moved about, organizing supplies and chatting with visitors. In the corner, a woman with a kind smile and curly brown hair was kneeling beside a child, helping him color a picture. "That's Amelia," Caleb said, nodding toward her. She's been waiting to meet you. Ethan swallowed hard as Caleb called out to her. Amelia looked up, her smile widening as she stood and approached them. Ethan, she said warmly, extending a hand. I've heard so much about you. Ethan hesitated before shaking her hand, his grip tentative. Hi. Amelia studied him for a moment, her eyes kind but assessing. You must be feeling a little overwhelmed. That's okay. We'll take things one step at a time. Ethan nodded, unsure of what else to say. Caleb excused himself, giving them space to talk. Amelia guided Ethan to a quieter corner, where she began asking him gentle questions about his life, his interests, and his hopes for the future. At first, Ethan's answers were short and guarded, but Amelia's patience and genuine interest gradually coaxed more out of him. By the end of their conversation, Ethan felt a small flicker of hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's life began to shift in ways he never thought possible. Amelia connected him with resources to help him find stability, including a temporary shelter and counseling to address the trauma he had carried for so long. With Caleb's encouragement, Ethan also began volunteering at the community center, helping with small tasks and getting to know others who had faced similar struggles. The work gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to get up each day. Maggie, too, found her own path forward. With support from the community center, she moved into a small apartment and began attending art therapy sessions. She and Ethan stayed in touch, their bond growing stronger as they supported each other through their journeys. One evening, as Ethan sat at the desk in his small room, he picked up a pen and a piece of paper. He thought about everything that had happened, about Caleb's persistence, Amelia's kindness, and Maggie's resilience. Slowly, he began to write. Dear Maggie, I just wanted to say thank you for being honest with me, for sharing your story, and for reminding me that kindness matters. You helped me see that it's okay to let people in, and that we don't have to face everything alone. I hope you're doing well in your new place. I know you'll create something beautiful there, just like you always have. Sincerely, Ethan. The story ends on a bright note, with Ethan enrolling in school and slowly building a future he never thought he could have. Caleb and Amelia remain by his side, their support unwavering. Maggie, too, begins to rediscover her love for painting, her work once again a source of light and healing. For Ethan, the road ahead isn't without challenges, but he faces it with newfound strength and hope. And as he walks forward, he carries with him the knowledge that even the smallest act of kindness can spark a change far greater than he ever imagined. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.